Good evening, dear listener. As the day draws to its gentle close and the world settles into the soft embrace of twilight, let us step together through the mists of time. Tonight we walk not through battle-elds or throne rooms load with the clash of swords, but through the quiet chambers where history's most formidable queens once sat in contemplation, watching shadows dance across stone walls by ickering candlelight. Close your eyes, if you will, and imagine the soft rustle of silk against cold marble oars. Picture the weight of golden crowns set aside for the evening, resting on velvet cushions, while their wearers gaze through narrow windows at stars that have watched over countless generations. These women, Isabella of France, Zetian, Joanna I of Naples, Margaret of Anjou, and Olga of Kiev, were not merely queens, but souls who carried the burden of nations upon their shoulders, making decisions in the quiet hours before dawn that would echo through centuries. Let your breathing slow and deepen as we begin this gentle journey. There is no urgency here, no need to remember dates or names. Simply allow yourself to drift alongside these remarkable women as they moved through their daily lives, feeling the smooth coolness of ancient stones beneath their feet, the warmth of sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, and the ever-present weight of responsibility that settled upon them like morning mist. Tonight, we speak not of violence or conquest, but of the quieter truths, how a letter sealed with wax could change the fate of kingdoms, how a single glance across a great hall could topple alliances, how the careful placement of a chess piece on an ivory board could determine the destiny of thousands. These were women who understood that true power often whispers rather than shouts, who knew that the most decisive battles are sometimes fought in silence, in the space between heartbeats, in the pause before a word is spoken. So settle into your pillows, let your mind wander freely, and join me as we visit each of these extraordinary women in turn. We shall see them not as the terrible queens of legend, but as human beings who woke each morning to face impossible choices, who brushed their hair by candlelight, who walked alone through empty corridors, carrying secrets that could topple thrones. In the gentle morning light of 14th century England, let us first visit Isabella of France, who history would remember as the she-wolf. But before we speak of wolves or warfare, let us see her as she truly was in the quiet moments, a young woman from across the Channel, barely 17, when she first walked through the great doors of Westminster Palace as England's new queen. Picture her chambers in those early days, decorated with the finest tapestries, depicting scenes of courtly love and flowering meadows. The walls were painted in soft blues and golds, colors that reminded her of the French countryside she had left behind. Each morning, she would wake to the sound of birds in the palace gardens, and her first act was always to move to the tall window that faced east, toward France, watching the sun rise over the land that had been her childhood home. Isabella's daily routine began with prayer in her private chapel, a small, intimate space where she knelt on embroidered cushions, her golden hair falling like a curtain around her shoulders. The morning light filtered through jeweled glass, casting rainbow patterns on the stone floor as she whispered her devotions. Her voice, they said, was musical, with the soft accent of the French court that she never quite lost despite decades in England. After her prayers, she would break her fast with delicate pastries and wine, served on silver plates that reflected the dancing flames of the hearth. Her ladies-in-waiting would gather around her, chattering softly in French about court gossip and news from home. Isabella would listen with half an ear while her fingers traced the intricate patterns on her favorite goblet, a wedding gift from her father, King Philip the Fourth of France. The palace gardens were her refuge in those early years of marriage. She would walk the gravel pathways in the afternoon, her silk skirts rustling against the hedgerows, stopping to examine the roses that the gardeners tended with such care. The scent of lavender and rosemary would cling to her sleeves, and she would often pause by the fountain in the center of the garden, watching the water cascade down the carved stone figures of angels and saints. But even in these peaceful moments, Isabella's mind was active, always observing, always calculating. She noticed which courtiers whispered when she passed, which of her husband's advisers avoided her gaze, which letters arrived by swift messenger and were spirited away before she could glimpse their seals. She began to understand that in the delicate ecosystem of the English court, information was more valuable than gold, and silence could be more dangerous than any sword. Her relationship with her husband, Edward II, was complex and often distant. He was a man of particular tastes and loyalties, devoted to his favorites in ways that left little room for a young queen seeking her place in a foreign court. Isabella would sit in the great hall during evening meals, watching her husband's attention focused entirely on Piers Gaveston, later Hugh Despenser, while she remained a decorative figure at his side, beautiful but essentially invisible. The loneliness of those early years shaped Isabella in ways that would echo through history. She would spend long evenings in her solar, the uppermost chamber of her tower, working on delicate embroidery by candlelight. The needlework was intricate, scenes of hunting parties and noble ladies, threads of gold and silver woven into patterns that told stories of courage and cunning. With each tiny stitch, she was perhaps stitching together her own plans, her own understanding of how power truly worked in the medieval world. As the years passed, Isabella's wardrobe evolved from the bright colors of youth to more sophisticated hues, deep burgundies, and midnight blues, fabrics that whispered of authority rather than innocence. She began to hold her own court sessions, receiving petitioners who sought her intervention in various matters. These sessions were held in a smaller chamber, more intimate than the king's great hall, where Isabella would sit in a chair draped with ermine, listening carefully to each request. The transformation from neglected queen to political force was gradual, like the slow changing of seasons. Isabella began to correspond regularly with her brothers in France, letters that traveled across the Channel in diplomatic pouches, their contents known only to the most trusted messengers. She would write these letters late at night, her pen moving carefully across parchment by the light of beeswax candles, choosing each word with the precision of a master craftsman. When diplomatic missions required her presence, Isabella discovered she had a gift for negotiation. She could sit across from hardened diplomats and noble lords, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her voice never rising above a pleasant conversational tone, while she maneuvered them toward agreements that served her purposes. Her smile was legendary, warm and engaging, yet somehow never quite reaching her eyes, which remained sharp and calculating even in moments of apparent friendship. The birth of her children brought new dimensions to Isabella's existence. Prince Edward, the future king, was born after several years of marriage, and Isabella held him for the first time in the early morning hours. With only the midwives and her most trusted ladies present, she gazed down at his tiny face, so similar to her own, and perhaps in that moment began to plan not just for her own future, but for his as well. Motherhood suited Isabella, but it also sharpened her political instincts. She understood that her children were not just beloved offspring, but chess pieces in the grand game of medieval politics. She supervised their education personally, ensuring they learned not just Latin and theology, but also the subtle arts of reading people's faces, of understanding what was not said in diplomatic conversations, of knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. The palace kitchens knew Isabella's preferences well. She favored simple foods prepared with elegant care, roasted peacock with herbs from her garden, delicate pastries filled with honey and almonds, wine mixed with water and spices that warmed her on cold English mornings. She often dined alone or with her children, preferring these intimate meals to the grand feasts where she was expected to sit beside a husband who barely acknowledged her presence. Isabella's private chambers became a kind of sanctuary where she could be herself rather than the decorative queen expected by court protocol. Here she would receive her most trusted advisors, men and women who recognized her intelligence and sought her counsel on matters both personal and political. These meetings were conducted in soft voices, with careful attention to who might be listening at doors or behind tapestries. The decision to take action against her husband's regime was not made in a moment of passion, but through careful consideration over many months. Isabella would walk her garden paths in the evening, ostensibly taking the air, but actually reviewing her options, considering the loyalty of various nobles, calculating the costs and benefits of different courses of action. The fountain continued to splash softly in the center of the garden, but Isabella's mind was now focused on currents far more dangerous than moving water. When she finally departed for France on what appeared to be a diplomatic mission, Isabella packed her belongings with the same careful attention she had always given to details. Her traveling chest contained not just clothing and personal items, but also letters of introduction to potential allies, gifts that might secure loyalty, and a detailed understanding of English politics that would prove invaluable in the months to come. The journey across the channel was smooth, with fair winds filling the sails of her ship. Isabella stood at the rail, watching the English coastline recede into the morning mist, knowing that when she returned, it would be not as a neglected queen, but as a force to be reckoned with. The salt air lifted her veil, and perhaps for the first time in years, she smiled with genuine joy rather than diplomatic necessity. In France, Isabella found herself welcomed, not just as King Philip's sister, but as a woman of substance in her own right. The French court had heard rumors of her intelligence and political acumen, and she was invited to participate in council meetings, to offer her insights on English affairs, to be treated as the capable ruler she had always known herself to be. The alliance with Roger Mortimer began as a political necessity, but evolved into something more complex. Mortimer was a man who had suffered under Edward II's rule, who understood the frustrations of being sidelined by incompetent leadership. Their conversations, conducted in quiet corners of French chateaux, were initially about military strategy and political alliances, but gradually became more personal as they recognized in each other kindred spirits who had been underestimated by their enemies. The invasion of England was planned with meticulous care. Isabella understood that her success would depend not on the size of her army, which was necessarily small, but on the support of English nobles who had grown weary of Edward II's misrule. She sent carefully coded messages to potential allies, using merchant networks and religious channels to communicate her intentions and gauge support. When her small force landed on the English coast, Isabella was dressed not in armor, but in traveling clothes suitable for a queen, making a diplomatic journey. She wanted to be seen as Edward's wife returning home, not as a foreign invader. Her demeanor was calm and confident as she greeted the English nobles who came to join her cause, accepting their oaths of loyalty with the grace of someone who had always expected such devotion. The campaign that followed was remarkably swift and bloodless. Isabella's forces grew as they moved inland, but the real battles were fought in private chambers where nobles weighed their options, in council meetings where advisors calculated the odds, in the quiet moments when men decided whether to support a failing king or a determined queen who offered hope for better governance. Edward VI's capture was almost anticlimactic after the months of careful planning. Isabella received the news while she was dining in her pavilion, surrounded by her advisors and allies. She listened to the report with apparent composure, asked a few practical questions about the arrangements for the former king's custody, and then calmly finished her meal before retiring to her private chambers to consider her next moves. The regency that followed was in many ways the fulfillment of Isabella's political ambitions. She governed England in her young son's name, but the real power was hers. She held court with the same attention to detail she had always applied to her personal affairs, listening carefully to petitioners, weighing advice from her counselors, making decisions that balanced practical necessity with long-term political strategy. Isabella's daily routine as regent was demanding but satisfying. She would rise early, attend Mass in the palace chapel, and then spend the morning in council meetings, addressing the various issues that faced the kingdom. Her afternoons were often devoted to diplomatic correspondence, writing letters to foreign rulers, negotiating treaties, maintaining the delicate web of alliances that kept England secure. The great hall where Isabella held court was transformed under her rule. Where once it had been dominated by her husband's favorites, it now reflected her own sense of order and purpose. The tapestries were rearranged to create a more welcoming atmosphere. The seating was organized to facilitate communication rather than display hierarchy, and the overall tone was one of efficient governance rather than idle ceremony. Isabella's relationship with her son Edward III was crucial to her political success. She was careful to involve him in governmental affairs, teaching him the practical skills of kingship while maintaining her own authority. Their private dinners became informal lessons in statecraft, with Isabella sharing her understanding of how to read people, how to balance competing interests, how to make difficult decisions with grace and confidence. The management of Edward II's captivity required delicate handling. Isabella understood that her former husband's continued existence was both a political necessity and a potential source of instability. She ensured that he was treated with the dignity appropriate to his former station, while being kept secure enough to prevent any attempts at restoration. The arrangements were made through intermediaries, allowing Isabella to maintain some distance from the practical details. Isabella's personal life during the Regency was complex. Her relationship with Mortimer continued, but it was conducted with discretion appropriate to her position as Queen Mother. They would meet in her private chambers for discussions that combined political strategy with personal intimacy, careful always to maintain the appearances necessary for Isabella's continued authority. The gardens of Isabella's various residences reflected her personal taste and political acumen. She commissioned new plantings that included herbs and flowers from France, creating spaces that reminded her of her childhood while also serving practical purposes. The gardens became places where she could conduct private conversations, where the sound of fountains and the rustle of leaves provided natural concealment for sensitive discussions. Isabella's wardrobe during the Regency combined regal magnificence with practical functionality. She favored rich fabrics and colors that conveyed authority, deep purples, midnight blues, and cloth of gold that caught the light and commanded attention. Her jewelry was chosen not just for beauty, but for symbolic meaning, with pieces that connected her to both her French heritage and her English authority. The daily routine of governance suited Isabella's temperament and abilities. She was comfortable with the weight of responsibility, skilled at managing the competing demands of various political factions, and adept at finding solutions that satisfied most interests while advancing her own agenda. Her council meetings were known for their efficiency and thoroughness, with Isabella ensuring that all viewpoints were heard before decisions were made. Isabella's correspondence during this period reveals her sophisticated understanding of international politics. She maintained regular communication with her brothers in France, with the papal court, with various European rulers who might prove useful allies or dangerous enemies. Her letters were carefully crafted documents that conveyed information while revealing as little as possible about her own intentions and strategies. The question of Edward II's death, when it came, was handled with the same careful attention to detail that Isabella applied to all political matters. She received the news while reviewing financial accounts in her private study, surrounded by ledgers and documents that represented the practical work of governance. Her reaction was composed and controlled, focusing immediately on the political implications and necessary responses. Isabella's regency gradually evolved as her son Edward III came of age and began to assert his own authority. She managed this transition with characteristic skill, maintaining her influence while allowing her son to assume the visible trappings of power. Their relationship remained close, but it was now that of advisor and king rather than regent and prince. The later years of Isabella's active political life were marked by her continued involvement in diplomatic affairs and her role as queen mother. She maintained her own household, her own court, her own network of allies and advisors. Her influence was felt in major policy decisions, though she was careful to work through established channels rather than appearing to challenge her son's authority. Isabella's retirement from active politics was gradual rather than sudden. She began to spend more time at her favorite residences, focusing on religious devotions and charitable works, while maintaining her interest in current affairs. Her correspondence continued, but it was now more personal than political, maintaining friendships and family connections rather than managing state business. The convent where Isabella spent her final years was a place of peace and contemplation, far removed from the political intrigues that had dominated her life. She maintained a small household of trusted servants and companions, continuing to live with the dignity appropriate to her station while embracing the simplicity of religious life. Her daily routine now centered on prayer and meditation, reading and reflection. In her quiet moments at the convent, Isabella would sometimes sit by her window, looking out over the gardens where flowers bloomed in careful patterns, their colors bright against the ancient stone walls. Perhaps she thought of other gardens, other windows, other moments when she had gazed out at the world and planned her next move in the endless game of medieval politics. Isabella's legacy was complex and enduring. She had transformed herself from a neglected queen into one of the most powerful women of her age, demonstrating that intelligence and determination could overcome the limitations imposed by medieval society on women. Her influence on English politics extended far beyond her own lifetime, affecting the development of parliamentary government and the relationship between monarchy and nobility. And so we leave Isabella of France, the she-wolf who was perhaps more accurately a master strategist, a woman who understood that true power comes not from force, but from intelligence, not from loud proclamations, but from quiet preparation, not from destroying one's enemies, but from making them irrelevant. In her final years, as she sat in her convent garden, watching the seasons change, she may have reflected on a life fully lived, choices made with courage and consequences accepted with grace. Now let us travel eastward, through the mists of time and across vast continents, to the golden courts of Tang Dynasty China, where lived a woman whose very name whispered power across the centuries. Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. But before we speak of thrones and empire, let us see her as she was in the quiet morning hours, alone in her chambers as dawn broke over the forbidden city. Picture her private quarters in the depths of winter, when snow lay heavy on the curved roofs of the palace and the frozen lakes reflected the pale light of early morning. Zetian's chambers were decorated in the imperial colors, deep gold and midnight blue, with silk hangings that moved gently in the heated air. The walls were adorned with calligraphy, each character brushed with perfect precision, poems that spoke of power and beauty, of the eternal cycle of seasons and the temporary nature of human ambition. Her morning ritual began before the sun appeared above the horizon. Zetian would wake not to the sound of servants or the bustle of court life, but to the gentle chiming of small bells carried on the morning wind. She preferred these moments of solitude, when she could sit before her bronze mirror and attend to the careful application of cosmetics that would transform her into the public figure the empire expected to see. The process was meditative, almost sacred. First, the white powder made from ground pearls and rice, applied with soft brushes made from the finest sable hair. Then the careful painting of her eyebrows, drawn high and elegant in the fashion of the court. Her lips were painted in the deepest red, made from cinnabar and safflower, a color that spoke of imperial authority and feminine power combined. Zetian's wardrobe was legendary throughout the empire. Each morning, she would choose from robes of silk so fine they seemed to be woven from captured moonbeams. The colors varied with the seasons and the political necessities of the day: golden yellow for important audiences, deep blue for diplomatic receptions, pristine white for religious ceremonies. Each garment was embroidered with dragons and phoenixes, symbols that together represented the perfect balance of masculine and feminine power. The palace gardens where Zetian walked in the early morning were masterpieces of careful design. Every stone was placed with intention, every tree pruned to perfection, every pathway designed to create vistas that pleased the eye while also serving symbolic purposes. The garden represented the empire in miniature, controlled, harmonious, beautiful but also somewhat artificial, maintained through constant effort and careful attention. Zetian's breakfast was served in porcelain, so delicate it was nearly transparent, painted with scenes of mountains and rivers that seemed to move in the morning light. She ate sparingly, a few bites of steamed fish, some delicate vegetables, tea that had been prepared with water from a specific mountain spring. Her movements were graceful and economical, each gesture calculated to convey dignity and self-control. The transformation from concubine to empress had been gradual, requiring skills that no traditional education could have taught. Wu Zetian had learned to read not just books, but faces, to understand the subtle currents of palace politics, to distinguish between genuine loyalty and calculated flattery. She developed a network of informants throughout the palace, servants and officials who kept her informed of conversations and plotting that might affect her position. Her intelligence was legendary, but it was paired with an understanding of human nature that made her political maneuvering devastatingly effective. Wu Zetian could sit in a council meeting, listening to ministers debate policy, while simultaneously calculating their individual motivations, their personal loyalties, their private ambitions. She spoke little in these meetings, but when she did speak, her words carried weight that went far beyond her official position. The art of calligraphy was one of Wu Zetian's great passions and political tools. She would spend hours in her private study, practicing the formation of characters with brushes of various sizes, creating documents that were not just functional, but beautiful. Her handwriting became recognizable throughout the empire, a symbol of her personal involvement in governmental affairs that could not be delegated to secretaries or ministers. Wu Zetian's children were both her greatest joy and her most complex political challenge. She loved them with the fierce devotion of any mother, but she also understood that they represented potential threats to her authority as well as her legacy. Their education was supervised personally, with careful attention not just to traditional subjects, but to the practical skills of leadership and the subtle arts of political survival. The palace library was Wu Zetian's refuge during the difficult middle years of her rise to power. She would spend entire afternoons among the scrolls and books, reading histories of previous dynasties, studying the strategies of successful rulers, learning from the mistakes of those who had fallen from grace. The library was quiet, except for the soft whisper of silk sleeves and the gentle sound of pages turning. Wu Zetian's religious observances were both personal and political. She would attend Buddhist ceremonies with apparent devotion, funding the construction of temples and the commissioning of religious art. But these public displays of piety were balanced by private meditation sessions, where she sought not just spiritual guidance, but also the mental clarity necessary for the complex decisions that ruling an empire required. The court musicians knew Wu Zetian's preferences well. She favored music that was complex but not ostentatious, melodies that could provide a background to deep thought without demanding attention. The sound of the qin, a seven-stringed instrument, often drifted through her chambers in the evening, played by skilled musicians who understood that their music should enhance rather than dominate the atmosphere. Wu Zetian's diplomatic receptions were masterpieces of careful orchestration. She would receive foreign ambassadors in halls designed to impress, wearing robes that conveyed imperial authority while speaking in measured tones that revealed nothing of her private thoughts. These meetings often lasted for hours, with elaborate tea ceremonies and formal presentations that allowed her to assess her guests while revealing little about her own intentions. The process of assuming the title of emperor was perhaps the most audacious political maneuver in Chinese history. Wu Zetian approached it with characteristic methodical planning, building support among key officials, neutralizing potential opposition, creating a political atmosphere where her elevation seemed not just possible, but inevitable. The actual ceremony was conducted with full imperial honors, but the real work had been done in countless private conversations and careful political calculations. As emperor, Wu Zetian's daily routine expanded to encompass the full scope of imperial responsibility. She would rise before dawn to review reports from throughout the empire, spend her mornings in council meetings, devote her afternoons to audiences with officials and petitioners, and use her evenings for private study and reflection. The work was demanding, but she approached it with the same systematic attention to detail that had characterized her rise to power. Wu Zetian's court was known for its efficiency and its atmosphere of controlled energy. Officials knew that their emperor was well informed and demanding, that casual work would be noticed and corrected, that excellence would be rewarded, but mediocrity would not be tolerated. The palace ran with the precision of a well-maintained clock, every function serving the greater purpose of effective governance. The empire's borders were secure during Wu Zetian's reign, but this security was maintained through careful diplomacy as much as military strength. She preferred to solve problems through negotiation and strategic alliances rather than warfare, understanding that sustainable power came from economic strength and political stability rather than military conquest alone. Wu Zetian's artistic patronage transformed the cultural landscape of Tang Dynasty China. She commissioned works that celebrated both traditional Chinese values and her own unique position as a female ruler. The art and literature created during her reign reflected a society that was prosperous, confident, and open to new ideas, while still maintaining respect for ancient traditions. The palace workshops during Wu Zetian's reign produced some of the finest examples of Chinese craftsmanship in history. She took personal interest in the work of artisans, often visiting the workshops to observe the creation of porcelain, silk, and metalwork that would represent Chinese civilization to the world. Her standards were exacting, but her appreciation for excellence inspired craftsmen to achieve new levels of skill and creativity. Wu Zetian's private correspondence reveals a woman of remarkable intellectual curiosity and emotional depth. She maintained relationships with scholars, poets, and religious leaders throughout the empire and beyond, engaging in discussions about philosophy, literature, and governance that went far beyond the formal requirements of her position. These letters were often written in her own hand, a personal touch that demonstrated her respect for the recipients. The question of succession occupied much of Wu Zetian's attention during her later years as emperor. She understood that her unique position as a female ruler made the transition of power particularly delicate, requiring careful planning to ensure stability and continuity. Her approach to this challenge demonstrated the same strategic thinking that had characterized her entire career, balancing personal desires with political necessities. Wu Zetian's meals during her years as emperor were elaborate affairs that combined nutrition with symbolism. Each dish was chosen not just for taste but for meaning, with ingredients that represented different regions of the empire, cooking methods that honored various cultural traditions, and presentations that reinforced her authority while demonstrating her care for her subjects' welfare. The imperial apartments where Wu Zetian lived during her reign were designed to provide both comfort and security. The rooms were spacious but not overwhelming, decorated with art that reflected her personal taste while also serving ceremonial functions. The furniture was crafted from the finest materials, but arranged in ways that facilitated both private relaxation and official business. Wu Zetian's religious practices evolved throughout her reign, reflecting both personal spiritual development and political necessities. She continued to support Buddhist institutions while also maintaining traditional Chinese religious observances, creating a synthesis that satisfied diverse constituencies while demonstrating her own intellectual sophistication and political acumen. The intelligence network that Wu Zetian maintained throughout the empire was perhaps the most sophisticated of its time. She received regular reports from officials and merchants, religious leaders and scholars, anyone who might provide useful information about conditions in distant provinces or potential threats to imperial authority. This information was carefully analyzed and used to make policy decisions that were remarkably well informed for the era. Wu Zetian's approach to justice was both pragmatic and principled. She understood that effective governance required consistent application of law, but she also recognized that rigid adherence to precedent could sometimes produce unfair results. Her court sessions were known for careful consideration of evidence and attention to the broader implications of judicial decisions. The palace gardens evolved during Wu Zetian's reign to reflect both traditional Chinese aesthetics and her own vision of imperial power. New plantings were added that represented different regions of the empire, creating a living map of Chinese civilization. The gardens became places where she could walk and think, where the beauty of nature provided a counterpoint to the complex demands of governance. Wu Zetian's patronage of scholars and intellectuals created an atmosphere of learning and innovation that characterized her reign. The palace library was expanded, new academies were established, and scholars were encouraged to pursue research that might contribute to the welfare of the empire. Her own intellectual interests were broad, encompassing history, philosophy, literature, and the practical arts of governance. The decision to abdicate was perhaps as carefully calculated as any decision Wu Zetian made during her remarkable career. She recognized that her advanced age and the political pressures surrounding the succession made abdication preferable to attempting to maintain power indefinitely. The transition was managed with characteristic attention to detail, ensuring stability while allowing her to retire with dignity intact. Wu Zetian's retirement was spent in comfortable quarters within the palace complex, where she could observe the continuing operations of government while no longer bearing direct responsibility for policy decisions. She continued to receive visitors and maintain correspondence, but her focus shifted from active governance to reflection on her remarkable career and its implications for Chinese history. The final years of Wu Zetian's life were marked by a kind of serene satisfaction. She had achieved something that no other woman in Chinese history had accomplished, ruling effectively as emperor while maintaining the stability and prosperity of the empire. Her legacy was secure, her place in history assured, her impact on Chinese civilization permanent. In her quiet moments during these final years, Wu Zetian would sometimes sit in her garden, watching the interplay of light and shadow on the carefully arranged stones and plants. Perhaps she reflected on the journey from young concubine to empress to emperor, on the countless decisions and careful calculations that had made such a transformation possible, on the price of power and the rewards of effective leadership. And so we leave Wu Zetian, the phoenix who rose from humble origins to the dragon throne, who understood that true power comes not from birth or circumstance, but from intelligence, determination, and the careful cultivation of political relationships. In her final moments, as she gazed out at the empire she had governed so effectively, she may have known that her name would be remembered not just as an anomaly in Chinese history, but as proof that extraordinary individuals can transcend the limitations of their time and circumstances. Let us now drift southward to the sun-drenched shores of medieval Italy, where the Mediterranean Sea laps gently against ancient stones and the scent of orange blossoms mingles with sea salt in the warm evening air. Here, in the kingdom of Naples, lived Joanna Pers, a queen whose name became synonymous with both beauty and controversy, but whose daily life was marked by the same quiet dignity that characterized all truly powerful women of her era. Imagine, if you will, the Castel Nuovo in Naples as it appeared in the 14th century, its towers rising against the brilliant blue sky, its walls warmed by the southern sun. Joanna's chambers were located in the highest tower, offering views across the bay to the smoking peak of Mount Vesuvius in the distance. These rooms were decorated in the Italian style of the period, walls painted with frescoes depicting classical scenes, furniture carved from dark wood and inlaid with ivory, windows that opened onto balconies where jasmine and roses climbed the stone walls in profuse abundance. Joanna's morning routine began with the sound of church bells echoing across the city, calling the faithful to prayer in dozens of small chapels and great cathedrals throughout Naples. She would rise from her bed of silk and down, her feet touching the cold marble floors that were softened by carpets brought from the east. Her first act each day was to step onto her balcony, breathing deeply of the warm, herb-scented air, while watching the fishing boats return to harbor with their silver catches gleaming in the early light. The Queen's bath was a daily ritual of luxury and contemplation. The water was perfumed with oils of lavender and rose, heated by servants who understood that their mistress valued these moments of private restoration. Joanna would soak in the warm water while gazing through the window at the bustling life of Naples below, perhaps thinking of the complex political calculations that would occupy her day, or simply enjoying the rare moments of peace that her position allowed. Joanna's wardrobe reflected both her royal status and her Italian heritage. She favored silks in the warm colors of the Mediterranean, golden yellows like sunlight on stone, deep blues like the sea at twilight, rich burgundies like the wine produced in the hills around Naples. Her gowns were cut in the latest fashion, with fitted bodices that emphasized her graceful figure and flowing skirts that rustled softly as she walked through the palace corridors. The jewelry worn by Joanna was legendary throughout Europe. She possessed crowns set with sapphires that matched her eyes, necklaces of pearls that had been fished from Mediterranean waters, rings that contained gems from the far reaches of the known world. But she wore these treasures not as mere decoration, but as symbols of her authority, choosing pieces that would reinforce her political messages while enhancing her natural beauty. Joanna's education had been extensive, befitting a woman who would rule in her own right. She spoke multiple languages fluently: Italian, French, Latin, and some Greek learned from Byzantine scholars who visited her court. Her private library contained works of classical literature, contemporary poetry, religious texts, and treatises on governance that she studied carefully, understanding that knowledge was as important as any crown or scepter. The court of Naples under Joanna's rule was renowned for its sophistication and cultural refinement. Scholars, artists, poets, and musicians were drawn to her court, creating an atmosphere of intellectual ferment that rivaled the great centers of learning elsewhere in Europe. Joanna herself participated in these cultural activities, not as a passive patron, but as an active participant in philosophical discussions and artistic endeavors. Joanna's marriage to Andrew of Hungary was arranged when she was still a child, but as she matured, the complexities of their relationship became apparent. Andrew was ambitious and somewhat crude, lacking the sophisticated understanding of Italian politics that effective rule required. Joanna, meanwhile, grew into a woman of remarkable intelligence and political acumen, creating a tension that would ultimately prove destructive to their marriage and to Andrew himself. The palace gardens where Joanna spent her afternoons were designed in the classical style, with geometrically arranged beds of flowers and herbs, fountains that provided cooling sounds on hot summer days, and shaded walkways where she could stroll while considering the various political challenges that faced her kingdom. The gardens were also used for informal diplomatic receptions, where important conversations could be conducted away from the formal atmosphere of the throne room. Joanna's approach to governance was methodical and informed. She would spend her mornings reviewing reports from throughout her kingdom, meeting with advisors to discuss policy options, and receiving delegations from various cities and regions within her realm. Her council meetings were known for their thorough consideration of issues, with Joanna asking probing questions that demonstrated her understanding of the complexities involved in effective rule. The death of Andrew of Hungary cast a shadow over Joanna's reign that would never fully lift. Whether she was directly involved in his murder or merely failed to prevent it, the scandal damaged her reputation throughout Europe and provided her enemies with ammunition that they would use against her for the rest of her life. Joanna handled the crisis with characteristic composure, publicly mourning her husband while privately working to maintain her political position. Joanna's second marriage, to Louis of Taranto, was more successful both personally and politically. Louis understood the complexities of Italian politics and was content to rule alongside Joanna rather than attempting to dominate her. Their partnership was based on mutual respect and shared political goals, creating a stable foundation for effective governance during the difficult years following Andrew's death. The papal court's relationship with Joanna was complex and sometimes tense. As a female ruler, she faced skepticism from church officials who preferred male monarchs, but her intelligence and diplomatic skills gradually won over many who had initially opposed her. She was careful to maintain good relations with the church while asserting her independence in temporal matters, a balance that required constant attention and careful maneuvering. Joanna's patronage of the arts transformed Naples into one of the cultural centers of medieval Europe. She commissioned frescoes for her palaces, supported poets and musicians, and encouraged the development of new forms of literary expression. Her court became a magnet for creative individuals throughout Italy and beyond, creating a cultural flowering that outlasted her political reign. The military challenges facing Joanna's kingdom required her to develop skills that few women of her era possessed. She studied military strategy, participated in planning sessions with her generals, and sometimes accompanied her armies in the field. Her presence was often more valuable than additional soldiers, as her subjects fought more effectively, knowing that their queen shared their dangers. Joanna's diplomatic correspondence reveals a woman of remarkable political sophistication. She maintained relationships with rulers throughout Europe, skillfully managing alliances and enmities that could affect her kingdom's security. Her letters were crafted with attention to both immediate political necessities and long-term strategic goals, demonstrating an understanding of international relations that was exceptional for her time. The palace kitchens during Joanna's reign reflected both her personal tastes and the abundance of her kingdom. Meals featured the finest ingredients from throughout the Mediterranean, fresh fish from the bay, vegetables and fruits from the fertile countryside, wine from the volcanic slopes of Vesuvius. Joanna preferred foods that were elegantly prepared but not ostentatious, understanding that dining could be both a pleasure and a political tool. Joanna's religious observances were sincere, but not excessive. She attended Mass daily, supported various religious institutions, and maintained good relationships with church leaders while avoiding the kind of ostentatious piety that might suggest weakness or uncertainty. Her faith provided her with personal strength, while also serving important political functions in a deeply religious age. The question of succession occupied much of Joanna's attention during her later years. Having no children of her own, she needed to carefully consider how to ensure the continued stability of her kingdom while satisfying the various political factions that might contest her chosen heir. Her approach to this challenge demonstrated the same thoughtful analysis that characterized all her major decisions. Joanna's third marriage, to James IV of Major Caux, was primarily political, designed to strengthen her kingdom's position in the complex web of Mediterranean politics. The marriage was conducted with appropriate ceremony, but both parties understood that it was a strategic alliance rather than a romantic union. Their relationship was cordial and businesslike, focused on their shared political interests. The later years of Joanna's reign were marked by increasing pressure from various political rivals who sought to challenge her authority. She faced these challenges with the same intelligence and determination that had characterized her entire career, but the constant need to defend her position took its toll on her health and energy. Despite these difficulties, she continued to govern effectively until the very end of her life. Joanna's fourth marriage, to Otto of Brunswick, was her final attempt to secure her dynasty and ensure the continued independence of her kingdom. Otto was a capable military leader who provided much-needed support during the difficult final years of her reign. Their partnership was based on mutual respect and shared commitment to the welfare of Naples, though it was cut short by the political circumstances that ultimately ended Joanna's rule. The palace where Joanna spent her final years remained a center of cultural and political activity, though the atmosphere was more subdued than during the height of her power. She continued to receive visitors, maintain correspondence, and participate in governmental decisions, but her focus shifted gradually from active governance to ensuring a smooth transition to her chosen successor. Joanna's legacy in Naples was complex but ultimately positive. She had maintained the independence of her kingdom during a period of great political instability, supported the development of art and learning, and demonstrated that a woman could rule effectively in the challenging environment of medieval Italian politics. Her influence on the cultural development of southern Italy was particularly significant and long-lasting. The tragic end of Joanna's life should not overshadow the remarkable achievements of her reign. She had transformed Naples from a peripheral kingdom into a significant political and cultural force, had demonstrated exceptional skill in diplomacy and governance, and had proven that intelligence and determination could overcome the limitations imposed by gender and circumstance in medieval society. In her final moments, as she sat in her chamber looking out over the Bay of Naples, Joanna may have reflected on a life that had been both triumphant and tragic. She had achieved much that seemed impossible for a woman of her era, had ruled effectively for decades, and had left a cultural and political legacy that would influence Italian history for generations to come. And so we bid farewell to Joanna of Naples, the rose among thorns, who understood that beauty and intelligence could be combined with political skill to create effective leadership. In the warm Mediterranean twilight, as the lights of Naples began to twinkle in the gathering darkness, her spirit may have found peace in the knowledge that she had served her people well and had left her kingdom more prosperous and cultured than she had found it. Our journey now brings us back to England, but to a different century and a different atmosphere entirely. Here, amidst the gray stone castles and mist-shrouded moors of the 15th century, we find Margaret of Anjou, a queen whose name became synonymous with the Wars of the Roses, yet whose daily life was marked by the same quiet determination and careful attention to detail that characterized all the remarkable women we have visited on this gentle journey through history. Picture, if you will, the royal chambers at Greenwich Palace on a cold February morning, when frost covers the diamond-paned windows and the Thames runs gray and sluggish beneath a pewter sky. Margaret's rooms were decorated in the French style of her youth, tapestries depicting scenes of courtly love and chivalric romance, furniture carved with the fleur-de-lis of her native Anjou, braziers burning sweet-scented wood that reminded her of the chateau where she had spent her childhood. Margaret's morning ritual began with prayer in her private chapel, a small intimate space where she knelt on embroidered cushions while morning light filtered through stained glass windows that cast jeweled patterns on the stone floor. Her devotions were sincere and personal, a source of strength that sustained her through the many trials that her position as queen would bring. She prayed not just for her own welfare, but for her husband, her son, and the peace of the realm that seemed always to hover just beyond reach. The transformation from French princess to English queen had been challenging for Margaret. She arrived in England as a young woman of 15, speaking little English and understanding less about the complex political situation that awaited her. Her first years were spent in careful observation, learning to read the faces and motivations of the English nobility while maintaining the dignity and composure expected of her royal station. Margaret's wardrobe reflected both her French heritage and her English royal status. She favored rich fabrics and colors that complemented her dark hair and pale complexion, deep blues like midnight sky, rich burgundies like fine wine, pristine whites that emphasized her youth and supposed innocence. Her gowns were cut in the latest fashion, with elaborate headdresses that added to her already impressive height and presence. The relationship between Margaret and her husband, Henry VI, was complex and often difficult. Henry was a gentle, pious man who preferred books and prayer to the practical demands of kingship. Margaret, meanwhile, possessed the strong will and political instincts that her husband lacked, creating a dynamic that would ultimately see her assume much of the real responsibility for governing the kingdom. Margaret's education in statecraft was acquired through necessity, rather than formal instruction. She learned to interpret the subtle signals of court politics, to understand the shifting loyalties of the nobility, to recognize the difference between genuine support and calculated flattery. Her French upbringing had prepared her for the ceremonial aspects of queenship, but the practical realities of English politics required skills she had to develop through experience. The palace gardens where Margaret walked during her pregnancies were designed in the English style, with carefully tended roses and herbs, gravel pathways that crunched softly underfoot, and secluded arbors where she could sit and contemplate the future of the dynasty she hoped to secure. The birth of her son Edward brought her great joy, but also added new dimensions to the political calculations that increasingly occupied her thoughts. Margaret's approach to motherhood combined personal devotion with political necessity. She was determined that her son would be properly prepared for his future role as king, but she also understood that his very existence made him a target for those who questioned the legitimacy of the Lancastrian claim to the throne. The nursery was therefore both a place of maternal love and a fortress designed to protect the most precious asset of the dynasty. The court over which Margaret presided was sophisticated, but often tense. The underlying political divisions that would eventually erupt into civil war were already apparent in the subtle hostilities between different factions of the nobility. Margaret navigated these dangerous waters with increasing skill, building alliances where possible, while preparing for conflicts that seemed increasingly inevitable. Margaret's correspondence during this period reveals a woman of growing political sophistication. She maintained regular communication with her family in France, seeking support for her husband's regime, while also keeping open diplomatic channels that might prove useful if the political situation in England deteriorated further. Her letters were carefully crafted to convey information while revealing as little as possible about her own strategic thinking. The daily routine of queenship suited Margaret's active temperament better than it might have suited a more retiring personality. She was comfortable with the demands of public ceremony, skilled at managing the complex social dynamics of court life, and increasingly effective at the behind-the-scenes political work that kept the Lancastrian regime functioning despite her husband's limitations. Margaret's religious observances were both personal and political. She attended multiple masses each day, supported various religious institutions, and maintained close relationships with church leaders who might provide both spiritual guidance and political support. Her piety was genuine, but she also understood the importance of maintaining good relations with the church in an age when religious and political authority were closely intertwined. The onset of Henry VI's periods of mental illness placed even greater responsibility on Margaret's shoulders. During these episodes, she effectively governed the kingdom in his name, making decisions that required both political acumen and personal courage. Her handling of these crises demonstrated remarkable skill and determination, though it also made her more visible as a political target. Margaret's patronage of literature and the arts created a cultural atmosphere at court that provided some relief from the constant political tensions. She commissioned works that celebrated Lancastrian achievements while also supporting scholars and artists whose work enriched English cultural life. Her personal library contained works in both French and English, reflecting her continuing connection to her homeland and her growing identification with her adopted country. The military aspects of Margaret's queenship were perhaps the most challenging for a woman of her background and training. She had to learn to work effectively with military commanders, to understand strategic concepts that had not been part of her education, and to make decisions that could affect the lives of thousands of soldiers and civilians. Her approach to these challenges was characteristically methodical and thorough. Margaret's relationship with the nobility was complicated by both her foreign birth and her growing political influence. Some nobles resented taking direction from a French queen, while others recognized her capabilities and were willing to work with her despite their reservations. She had to constantly balance the need for support against the dangers of alienating powerful individuals who might otherwise remain neutral. The palace where Margaret held court during the height of her influence was a center of both political and cultural activity. The Great Hall hosted elaborate feasts that served important diplomatic functions, while smaller chambers provided venues for the private discussions where real political business was conducted. Margaret's personal apartments were both comfortable living spaces and secure locations for sensitive meetings. Margaret's approach to diplomatic relations reflected both her French background and her English responsibilities. She maintained cordial relations with the French court, while also working to secure alliances with other European powers that might support the Lancastrian cause. Her diplomatic correspondence was sophisticated and nuanced, demonstrating her understanding of the complex web of international relationships that affected English politics. The financial management of the royal household fell increasingly to Margaret, as Henry's ability to handle such practical matters declined. She worked closely with treasury officials to ensure that the court could maintain appropriate standards of luxury and ceremony, while also funding the military activities that were becoming increasingly necessary. Her attention to these details demonstrated the practical skills that complemented her political abilities. Margaret's personal relationships with her ladies-in-waiting and other court women provided both companionship and political intelligence. These women served as her eyes and ears throughout the court, reporting on conversations and developments that might affect her position. The relationships were complex combinations of genuine friendship and political necessity, reflecting the realities of life at a medieval court. The challenge of maintaining royal dignity during periods of political crisis tested all of Margaret's skills and determination. She had to project confidence and authority even when the situation was desperate, to maintain the ceremonies and protocols that reinforced royal authority even when that authority was being challenged by armed rebels. Her performance during these trials was remarkable for its consistency and effectiveness. Margaret's exile and eventual return to England marked the most dramatic period of her political career. She demonstrated remarkable resilience and determination, maintaining her claim to royal status even when living in foreign courts with limited resources. Her ability to retain the loyalty of key supporters despite her reduced circumstances testified to her personal charisma and political skills. The Battle of Tewkesbury marked the effective end of Margaret's political career, though she lived for many years afterward. The death of her son Edward in the battle was a personal tragedy that also represented the end of the Lancastrian dynasty's hopes for restoration. Margaret's behavior during this crisis demonstrated the personal courage that had characterized her entire career. Margaret's captivity after Tewkesbury was handled with the respect due to her former royal status, though her political influence was effectively ended. She was housed in comfortable quarters and allowed to maintain a small household, but her days of directing policy and influencing major events were over. She adapted to these changed circumstances with the same dignity she had shown throughout her career. The negotiations for Margaret's ransom and eventual return to France occupied several years and involved complex diplomatic arrangements. Her release was finally secured through the intervention of her French relatives, though the financial terms were onerous and required her to renounce any future claims to English royal status. She accepted these conditions with apparent grace, understanding that her political career was ended. Margaret's final years in France were spent in comfortable retirement at various chateaux provided by her royal relatives. She maintained a modest household and continued to receive visitors, though her conversation focused more on memories of past glories than on current political developments. Her health gradually declined, but she retained her mental faculties and her dignity until the end. The chateau where Margaret spent her final years was situated in the Loire Valley, surrounded by the peaceful countryside that had shaped her youth. She would sit in the gardens during fine weather, watching the changing seasons and perhaps reflecting on the remarkable journey that had taken her from French princess to English queen to political exile and finally to peaceful retirement. Margaret's death in 1482 marked the end of an era in English and French history. She had witnessed and participated in some of the most dramatic events of the 15th century, had demonstrated remarkable courage and political skill under the most challenging circumstances, and had left a legacy that would influence historical memory for generations to come. And so, we leave Margaret of Anjou, the white rose in winter, who understood that political survival required not just intelligence and determination, but also the ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining personal dignity and purpose. In the quiet chambers of her final years, as she gazed out at the peaceful French countryside, she may have found a serenity that had long been absent from her eventful life, secure in the knowledge that she had faced every challenge with courage and grace. Our final journey takes us far to the east, across the vast plains of medieval Europe to the ancient city of Kiev, where the Dnieper River flows broad and slow beneath endless skies. Here, in the 10th century, when most of Europe was still emerging from the shadows of the Dark Ages, lived a woman whose name would echo through the centuries as both saint and warrior, though her daily life was marked by the same quiet dignity and careful attention to duty that we have observed in all these remarkable women. Imagine, if you will, the wooden fortress that crowned the hills above Kiev, its walls rising like a crown against the northern sky. Olga's chambers were located in the highest tower, offering views across the river to the forests that stretched unbroken to the horizon. These rooms were furnished in the style of the time, carved wooden furniture adorned with furs and rich fabrics, walls hung with tapestries that told stories of heroes and gods, braziers that burned continuously to ward off the bitter cold of the northern winters. Olga's morning ritual began before dawn, when the world was still wrapped in the blue silence that comes before sunrise. She would rise from her bed of down and furs, her feet touching the wooden floors that had been smoothed by countless years of use. Her first act each day was to step onto the balcony that overlooked the river, breathing deeply of the clear, cold air, while watching the mists rise from the water like the spirits of ancient prayers. The transformation from Varangian princess to Rus regent had been gradual but profound. Olga had arrived in Kiev as a young woman, speaking the Norse tongue of her homeland, while learning the Slavonic dialects of her new people. Her early years were spent in careful observation, learning to understand the complex tribal relationships that determined the balance of power in this vast and often dangerous land. Olga's wardrobe reflected both her Scandinavian heritage and her adopted Slavic culture. She favored rich fabrics in the dark colors that complemented her northern complexion, deep blues like the winter sky, rich purples like the shadows of evening, warm browns like the earth of the steppes. Her gowns were cut in styles that emphasized both her royal status and her practical nature, with sleeves that could be pushed back for work and skirts that would not impede her movement through the muddy streets of medieval Kiev. The relationship between Olga and her husband, Prince Igor, was based on mutual respect and shared commitment to the welfare of their people. Igor was a warrior in the traditional mold, skilled in battle and diplomacy, but less interested in the day-to-day administration that effective governance required. Olga, meanwhile, possessed the systematic mind and attention to detail that complemented her husband's more dramatic abilities. Olga's education in statecraft was acquired through necessity and natural ability rather than formal instruction. She learned to interpret the complex relationships between different tribal groups, to understand the economic forces that drove trade along the river routes, to recognize the difference between temporary alliances and lasting loyalties. Her Scandinavian background had prepared her for the practical aspects of leadership, but the unique challenges of ruling in the Rus's lands required skills she had to develop through experience. The fortress where Olga lived with her family was both a home and a military stronghold. The walls were built of massive wooden logs, with towers that provided excellent views of the surrounding countryside and the river approach to the city. The interior spaces were designed to accommodate both the domestic needs of the royal family and the political functions of governance, with great halls for feasting and receiving delegations, private chambers for confidential discussions, and quarters for the substantial military garrison that provided security. Olga's approach to motherhood was shaped by the violent realities of her world. She was devoted to her son Sviatoslav, but she also understood that his future would depend on his ability to survive in a political environment where strength and cunning were essential for survival. The nursery was therefore both a place of maternal love and a training ground where the future prince would learn the skills necessary for effective leadership. The tragedy of Igor's death transformed Olga from princess to regent, placing her in a position of responsibility that few women of her era had experienced. She handled the crisis with characteristic composure, immediately taking steps to secure her son's inheritance, while also planning her response to the tribal confederation that had killed her husband. Her actions during this period demonstrated both her political acumen and her understanding of the psychology of leadership in a warrior culture. Olga's revenge against the Drevlians became legendary, but the careful planning and psychological insight that made it possible were perhaps more remarkable than the violence itself. She understood that in the political environment of 10th century Eastern Europe, mercy could be interpreted as weakness, while a carefully orchestrated demonstration of power could establish her authority for generations to come. The administrative reforms that Olga implemented during her regency were perhaps her most lasting contribution to the development of the Rus's state. She established regular tribute collection systems, created administrative districts that improved governmental efficiency, and developed diplomatic relationships that enhanced the security and prosperity of her realm. These achievements required sustained effort and attention to detail that went far beyond the dramatic gestures for which she is better remembered. Olga's religious journey from paganism to Christianity was gradual and thoughtful, rather than sudden or emotional. She was exposed to Christian ideas through her diplomatic contacts with the Byzantine Empire, but her decision to convert was based on careful consideration of both personal and political factors. Her Christianity was sincere and deeply felt, but it was also informed by her understanding of how religious conversion might affect her political position and her realm's international relationships. The palace where Olga held court during the height of her power was a center of both political and cultural activity. The Great Hall hosted elaborate feasts that served important diplomatic functions, where the complex rituals of gift-giving and oath-taking reinforced political alliances and tribal relationships. Olga presided over these ceremonies with dignity and skill, understanding that pageantry and protocol were essential tools of medieval statecraft. Olga's diplomatic correspondence reveals a woman of remarkable political sophistication for her time and place. She maintained relationships with the Byzantine court, exchanged ambassadors with various European rulers, and managed the complex web of tribal relationships that determined the balance of power in Eastern Europe. Her letters were crafted to convey information while protecting her strategic interests, demonstrating an understanding of international relations that was exceptional for the 10th century. The military aspects of Olga's regency required her to work effectively with commanders who might have preferred male leadership. She had to understand strategic concepts, make decisions about troop movements and supply lines, and maintain the loyalty of warriors who respected strength above all other qualities. Her approach to these challenges was characteristically direct and practical, focusing on results rather than protocol. Olga's patronage of trade and commerce contributed significantly to the prosperity of Kiev during her regency. She understood that military power alone was insufficient for long-term stability, that economic development was essential for the welfare of her people and the security of her realm. Her policies encouraged trade along the river routes that connected Scandinavia with Constantinople, bringing wealth and cultural exchange to the Rus lands. The fortress gardens where Olga walked during the brief northern summers were practical rather than ornamental, featuring herbs and vegetables that contributed to the household's food supply. But these gardens also provided a peaceful refuge where she could think and plan, where the quiet work of cultivation provided a counterpoint to the violent realities of medieval politics. Olga's personal relationships with the women of her court provided both companionship and political intelligence. These relationships were complicated by her foreign birth and her Christian conversion, both of which set her apart from many of her subjects. She had to navigate these complexities while maintaining the support and loyalty that her political position required. The challenge of preparing her son Sviatoslav for eventual rule occupied much of Olga's attention during his youth. She understood that he would face different challenges than she had, that his legitimacy would depend on his ability to demonstrate the warrior virtues that their society valued most highly. Her approach to his education combined traditional military training with the practical skills of governance that her own experience had shown to be essential. Olga's pilgrimage to Constantinople was perhaps the most remarkable journey of her life, demonstrating both her personal courage and her political acumen. The trip was dangerous and expensive, requiring months of travel through potentially hostile territory, but it served important diplomatic and religious purposes while also establishing her credentials as a Christian ruler worthy of respect from the Byzantine court and other European powers. The reception that Olga received in Constantinople was befitting her status as a major European ruler. She was housed in the imperial palace, received in formal audience by the emperor, and treated with the respect due to someone who controlled important trade routes and commanded significant military forces. Her behavior during these ceremonies demonstrated the dignity and sophistication that had characterized her entire career. Olga's baptism into the Christian faith was conducted with appropriate ceremony in the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church of the Orthodox world. The event was both a personal spiritual milestone and a significant political statement, marking her formal entry into the community of Christian rulers, while also establishing important precedents for the eventual Christianization of the Rus lands. The return journey to Kiev was perhaps less dramatic than the outward voyage, but it marked the beginning of a new phase in Olga's life and reign. She brought back with her not just personal spiritual enrichment, but also diplomatic agreements, cultural exchanges, and political relationships that would influence the development of her realm for generations to come. Olga's efforts to Christianize her subjects met with mixed success during her lifetime. Many of the Rus nobility remained committed to traditional pagan beliefs and practices, while others were willing to consider the new religion for political or economic reasons. Her approach to this challenge was patient and practical, understanding that religious conversion could not be forced but required careful cultivation over time. The relationship between Olga and her son Sviatoslav became more complex as he reached adulthood and began to assert his own political and religious views. Sviatoslav remained committed to traditional pagan beliefs and warrior culture, creating tension with his mother's Christian convictions and more diplomatic approach to governance. Their disagreements were conducted with mutual respect, but they reflected deeper differences about the future direction of the Rus' state. Olga's gradual retirement from active governance was managed with characteristic skill and attention to continuity. She understood that her son needed to establish his own authority while also ensuring that the administrative and diplomatic achievements of her regency would not be lost. The transition was conducted over several years, allowing for a smooth transfer of power while maintaining political stability. The later years of Olga's life were devoted increasingly to religious devotion and charitable works. She founded churches and monasteries, supported the Christian community in Kiev, and worked to establish the institutional foundations that would eventually support the Christianization of the Rus' lands. Her faith provided her with personal satisfaction while also serving important political and cultural functions. The convent where Olga spent her final years was a place of peace and contemplation, far removed from the political intrigues that had dominated her earlier life. She maintained a modest household and continued to receive visitors, but her focus was now on spiritual rather than political matters. Her daily routine centered on prayer and meditation, reading and reflection on the remarkable journey that had brought her from Scandinavian princess to Christian saint. Olga's death in 969 marked the end of an era in the history of the Rus lands. She had transformed a collection of tribal territories into a unified state, had established diplomatic relationships that enhanced the security and prosperity of her realm, and had laid the foundations for the eventual Christianization of Eastern Europe. Her influence on the development of Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian civilization was profound and lasting. The canonization of Olga as a saint in the Orthodox Church reflected recognition of both her religious devotion and her political achievements. She was honored not just as a Christian convert, but as a ruler who had used her power to benefit her people and advance the cause of civilization in a dangerous and unstable world. And so we leave Olga of Kiev, the saint in her fortress, who understood that true strength comes not from violence alone, but from the combination of courage, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to one's people and principles. In the quiet chambers of her final years, as she gazed out over the great river that had brought her to this distant land, she may have reflected on a life that had transformed not just her own destiny, but the course of history itself, secure in the knowledge that her legacy would endure long after the wooden walls of her fortress had crumbled to dust.